Who do you obey and why? Hey friends, it's Pastor Mike from Fellowship Church. Always love connecting with you midweek. Hope you had a wonderful spring break if you went anywhere. Good to have you back. We're still kind of basking in the aftermath of Easter, a wonderful time of the year. Just a quick thought, I will be on vacation next week, so there won't be a midweek video next week. But that question for you again, who do you obey and why? Let me share with you a little summary of a story from the Bible. It happens in a really cool book called Acts. It's Acts chapter 5. So this is not long after Jesus' resurrection. The disciples are still just filled with the Spirit and awe and wonder of all that took place. Acts chapter 5 begins with the disciples. They're in the temple courts, specifically Peter and some others, and they are talking about Jesus. Of course, who else would they be talking about? And the Bible says they're very specifically talking about new life. What a great topic. The temple authorities are less than thrilled with this. Apparently they weren't a happy part of the audience, so they arrest the disciples. They put them in jail for the night. In the middle of the night, an angel comes, opens the door, the disciples walk out, angel closes the door again, the disciples are free, and the next morning they're right back in the temple courts talking about Jesus again. The temple authorities go to the jail, find the jail cell locked with no disciples, out to the temple courts, arrest them all over again. Kind of a funny story when you think about it. Bring the disciples in and start questioning them. And the questions are along the lines of, in whose name are you doing this? And then the temple authorities ultimately say, you are forbidden to talk about Jesus in the temple courts ever again. And the disciples, you might think, would kind of slink away and say, well, they told us not to, meaning we can't talk about Jesus in public ever again. But the disciples, they chose a different path. And there's a really great verse in Acts chapter 5 where Peter says to the temple authorities, we must obey God rather than men. Really important phrase there. Of course, the disciples then face some consequences because the temple authorities had the authority to impose some consequences on them, severe consequences. They release them, and the disciples go right back to the temple courts and start talking about Jesus again. Great thought there. So the disciples made very clear that they were following God, that they were going to obey God before they obeyed men. So their obedience was vertical rather than horizontal. They faced consequences, but it had no effect on them. They continued to do exactly what Jesus told them to do. But then we have this passage in Romans chapter 13, the next book in the Bible, where the Apostle Paul says, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities. Now, a little difference in terminology there. He didn't say let everyone obey. He said let everyone be subject to the governing authorities. And Paul goes on to talk about paying your taxes. Hey, that makes a lot of sense. It's that week for us too. But here's the question for you. Who do you obey and why? Because in Acts chapter 5, we have the disciples saying, we're going to obey God rather than men or people. And then the next book of the Bible, when the Apostle Paul is writing to some people who lived in Rome, he says, don't forget, you have to obey the civic authorities. Now, another quick thought is that in Acts chapter 5, we're talking about the temple authorities, whereas the Apostle Paul is writing about civic authorities, different kinds of authorities. A lot of people have said over the years, well, Paul's writing to people who live in Rome. That's where Caesar lives. Yeah, they're not going to live very much longer if they don't obey Caesar. A lot of debate has taken place about this issue over the years, which is, how do we obey God and yet still obey and honor and submit to governing authorities? How do we do both of those at the same time, specifically when they conflict with each other? And here's my question for you. What would you do if your faith conflicted with a law? What would you do if the government very specifically had a law that conflicted with your faith? How would you respond? How would you choose? How would you exercise your own sense of discernment, wisdom of the Spirit, and all of that? Well, friends, not an easy topic. People have been debating this for centuries, millennia, because from the time of Jesus, people have been saying, how do we honor God with our lives and at the same time allow ourselves to be subject to governing authorities? Well, friends, that's, again, no easy answers here, difficult topic, but the great question for you today maybe is, how do you choose to obey? And who do you obey? And how do you make those decisions? And where do you draw the lines for yourself? And what would it take for you to say to civic authorities, I can't obey that because I'm following God instead? We call that civil disobedience. How do you make those decisions? Well, friends, that's where the discernment of the Spirit comes in. May God give you a lot of wisdom so that both Acts 5 and Romans 13 are lived out in your life, and may Jesus Christ be Lord of all of it. Friends, I hope that makes a little bit of sense to you. Honestly, it raises more questions than answers for me. May the Lord bless you with a lot of that wisdom and discernment. Again, I won't have a video next week because I'll be out of the office for a week, but may the Lord bless you. Hope you have a wonderful week. Know that we love you and pray for you all the time. Take care. God bless. Bye-bye.